Hello YouTube and welcome back to Redline Revs. Today we're going to be doing an oil filter change on this Mercedes R350 CDI. This is a 3-litre V6 turbo diesel engine which was used by Mercedes in many vehicles, including this R-Class as well as C, GL, ML, E, S350 CDI. Anything with a 350 CDI badge has this engine, as well as the more recent GLC and CLS vehicles and some old Jeeps as well. The engine oil to use here is 5W30, fully synthetic. This is Castrol 5W30M and it's 229.52. You need Mercedes approval 229.52 rated oil. It takes about 8.5 litres of oil in these engines, and I've also got the oil filter here which is the OX380D. First things first, you want to make sure that you've jacked the car up securely. I've got my trolley jack here on the side jacking points on my R-Class, and underneath I found some good positions to place axle stands. Do not get under a car without axle stands, make sure you're using them. And I'm also using the factory jack which came in the boot of the vehicle on the other side, as well as using another axle stand just propped up here for good measure at the rear. Chock the rear wheels, because you don't want the car to be rolling. And then you want to take off these screws. I've already got this one out. These are 10mm screws on the under tray of the vehicle at the front. It's just a front under tray that you want to remove, and you've got these 10mm bolts all around, and then there's these 4 at the back which secure the front under tray to the rear under tray. If you have a different vehicle to an R-Class, you may have a different under tray, but Mercedes always use these 10mm bolts. I've got most of them out now and just a couple left at the front to take out, and it's a little bit frustrating to have to go around taking all these out, but once you get stuck in and start doing it, it's really easy to do. So just get on with it. Get your 10mm socket on your ratchet and get them out. This one's coming out now, and I've got one left to do. Taking that off with a ratchet, and now I'm unscrewing it with my hands. And because I've only got one hand here, I'm using my leg to gently lower the under tray. You can see at the rear of my under tray I do have an oil leak. The 350 CDI engines were notorious for having oil cooler seals deteriorating. Mine were changed about 5 years ago. They're leaking again, but today all we're changing is the engine oil. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 of these 10mm screws that you need to take out from that front under tray. Once you've got the front under tray removed, you have access to the sump, and the sump plug is right here towards the front of the vehicle. You can reach that very easily without getting under the car anymore. And it's a 13mm socket which I found to go over the sump plug. Position your oil can. Remember, these vehicles take 8.5 litres of oil or so you want to have enough capacity in your oil pan, and this one takes 8 litres of oil. Once you've cracked the initial tension off the sump with your ratchet, undo the sump plug with your hands. It's a good idea to have driven the vehicle for a while or left it running so that you get a warm stream of oil coming out. Make sure you're ready to reposition your catch pan if you need to, and it might be a good idea to also have some cardboard down so you don't get too much oil on the drive. Again, very important to have run the car or driven it before you do this, because when the oil is hot it will flow out much more easily and you'll get more of that old oil out. I've got the car jacked up at an angle. Ideally you want to have it on lifts, or you want to have it level to get all of that oil out. Right, my 8 litre catch pan is full up, so I've had to switch to another catch pan that I've got ready for the drip that's now coming out. And then you can take off the engine cover by lifting it up and pulling it out. So here is the oil filler cap, and I'm just going to undo that and leave it sat there because that air circulation will help us get more of the old oil out. And there is your oil filter, which we'll move on to next. I like to use this oil filter wrench tool on my ratchet, which I find works for pretty much every oil filter application. Initially you just want to crack the tension of it. There was a fuel line here which was getting in the way, and I only had one hand as I'm filming with the other, but I found that I needed to do small fractions of a turn because that's all this tool would allow, given that line that's in the way. Do this carefully, don't be a savage about it, because this oil filter housing is not disposable. It's a unit that you need to reuse, and it's only the oil filter element that we change within it. Once you've cracked that initial tension off with whatever tool you're using, you can unscrew this by hand. And once you've unscrewed it, just let the oil drip out because there will be some oil in here. Give it a bit of a shake. Let the oil drip out. And quickly turn it upside down. Might be an idea to have an oil catch pan under your hands when you do that. And there is the old oil filter out. I've got some leftover oil from my previous oil top-ups. I've got about half a litre here, and while the oil is still dripping out, I'm going to pour this through the engine. The idea behind this is just that it pulls out some more of the old oil that might be deposited within the engine and helps you get a cleaner oil change. It's just half a litre I had in that bottle from previous oil top-ups. I'm just pouring that into the engine oil compartment here. And then I've taken about 250 ml of oil from my new oil bottle, and I'm pouring that down the oil filter side as well. Again, you don't have to do this. Some of you may be looking at it like that's a waste of new oil, but I can see that it does help to pull some of that old oil out, and given that I haven't got the car level like you're supposed to have, I just thought it would be a good idea to do this. Right, let's move on to the oil filter. You can pull the oil filter element out of the oil filter housing. On mine there were 2 O-rings, so you really need a pick tool or something to get this out. I couldn't find my pick tool at the time, but I had this pair of scissors nearby which I decided to grab and use to take this O-ring off. Whatever you do use, just make sure you're careful with this because this oil filter housing is not disposable. So just be careful you don't damage the threads or the housing itself, and either pick at it or pull it off with the scissors or cut it to get it off. And then at the tip here you have another smaller O-ring which needs to come off as well. There's the smaller O-ring. And that's now off too. This stem may be a little bit different on yours. Now in your oil filter, you've got your oil filter element and your new O-rings. The new oil filter took a little bit of force to just push it down, and then it clicks when you get it into the correct position. Now I'm just going to put on the new O-rings that came in the packet. The larger O-ring will just go over the screw top and it finds its way towards the bottom. you will notice towards the ends of the thread there is a groove in which this O-ring can seat. Just make sure it's correctly seated within the... Notice it doesn't go all the way down to the lip of the oil filter housing, but there is this groove there, and just make sure it's not crossing over onto any of the threads of the screw top. Always a good idea to put some engine oil on these O-rings. You have to do that to make sure that it seals correctly, and you can either use some of the old oil that's dripping all over the place, or dip your finger in a new oil bottle and lube them up. Then I've got the small O-ring here which goes on the tip. Once that's found its way into its groove, again check that everything's seated correctly and oil it up. These O-rings need to be nicely oiled up. Let's get some more oil on that one too. Here is your new sump plug. So you can see the part number on mine here. It's a plug that's used across many Mercedes models. And it's always a good idea to use a new sump plug. The crush washer, which is a copper one, faces towards the sump, and the shiny washer faces towards the nut. And just carefully screw that in with your hands into the sump. Make sure you're not cross-threading here. Bit of a gust of wind there. Tighten it as much as you can with your hands, being careful not to cross-thread. And once you've tightened that as much as you can with your hands, you can take your ratchet and start applying some tension to it. I believe it's 35 Newton meters of torque that Mercedes request for the sump plugs. I don't have a way of measuring the torque that I'm applying here, so I just make sure that I put them on tightly enough that they're not going to come off, and that I've made sure that I've crushed that crush washer a little bit, and just give myself the satisfaction that it's secure and won't come off. And now we can start filling in some engine oil now that the sump plug is back on. I'm filling in initially from the oil filter side, and I do this on these larger engines just because, you know, it's a V6. I want to make sure there's oil on both sides when we start her up. Pour it in slowly. You know, some people say do 50-50 oil in the oil filter on the other side, but I only put about 2 liters in there. And then you can hand tighten the oil filter back on with a new filter inside. I believe it's 25 Newton meters of torque that Mercedes requests for the oil filter, but I just tightened mine by hand as much as I could, and then I took my glove off and gave it some friction with skin to oil filter to tighten it as much as I can by hand. And now we can pour the rest of the oil into the oil filler cap. It should be between 8 and 8.5 liters of oil that it takes. I'm just going to pour between the oil filter and the engine oil filler cap. I'm going to pour my 8 liters in, and then when I've got the car off the jacks and it's on level ground and I've let the oil circulate by running the engine, then I'll check the dipstick and top up accordingly. Make sure they're both screwed back on, the oil filter and the engine oil cap, and start her up. Just check that there's no oil pressure warnings on your dashboard, which is that red pan symbol, and check that there's no leak from the sump plug before you put the cover back on. And now I'm just replacing the under tray. These 2 indented screws on the plastic under tray, I found it made sense to put them on first, and they kind of hold the under tray in place and allow you to go around putting the others in. And I put them in by hand, or with my 10mm socket in my hand, or with a bit of a ratchet if need be. And I just placed them all in there first, loosely all around, and then went and tightened them up with a ratchet. And that's the last one there for me to tighten. now you can see that's all securely back on, and the rear of the front under tray is also secured with those 4 10mm bolts into the central under tray. Now you can pull out the dipstick once the car is leveled, give it a wipe, put it back in, and then pull it back out to check your oil level. Some people say to fill it between the max and min line halfway, but I like to carefully pour mine right to the top of the max line on the dipstick, just because I'm going to be driving this car to Germany on the Autobahn in the next couple of weeks. But be careful, do not overfill it, be very careful here. It's better to fill a bit and check. And once you're satisfied with the oil fill, mine took 8.5 litres, you can just place the engine cover back on and push it down. And that's it. That's how you change the oil and oil filter on the Mercedes 350 CDI engines. Again, this engine is used in many different vehicles, but the under tray that you have might be a little bit different to what you saw on my R-Class. Now we can go ahead and reset the service indicator. When I put the key into ignition 2 position, you can see there's the service warning that's coming up on the dash. Put it back in 1 position, use the up and down arrows, get to the mileage on the screen, and then push down this R button. And I just held this down, so that's reset that. And I just kept holding it, and eventually it took me to a screen showing my mileage again. And again, holding it or depressed it and pushed it back in. There we go. And it's reset this trip computer. And then I pushed it 3 times and it took me to this UB symbol, and when I pressed down on the left controls, it took me into this menu, and then the plus and minus on the volume controls on the right hand of the steering allowed me to go down to confirmation, and this menu button allowed me to select that, and then full service, select that, and the service is now confirmed and registered. So once we turn the engine off and then back on, it will no longer give us that service indication. There we go. Engine is on, no more warnings on the dash about servicing. That's been registered in the vehicle's computer. And that's how you do it. That's how you change the oil on a Mercedes 350 CDI. Again, this engine is used in many different vehicles. You can follow these steps, and I hope you found them useful. Just make sure you're safe when you're working here, and don't overfill the engine oil. Don't damage anything while you're doing it. Thank you for watching. Make sure you comment, rate, and subscribe.